subject of high lake water levels suffers from a perception problem. Results from a recent Muskegon Chronicle poll indicate that many of us think it's only a problem for lakeshore residents. While that may be immediately true, it's an issue that will eventually affect us all. Those who navigate these waters, bathe on these beaches in the summer, and who drink from its waters.
Well, 6% doesn't sound like a very large increase. But if you spread that 6% over about 300,000 square miles of the Great Lakes Basin, it ends up being an awfully lot of water.
The Corps of Engineers says they are responding to our dilemma, and yet we watch the lake continue to go up.
You keep blaming people, but that doesn't remedy our problem. It's a serious problem.
Two additional natural factors affect levels of the Great Lakes: inflow from the upper lake and outflow to the next lower. Michigan and Huron get their water from Lake Superior through the St. Mary's River, which flows out via the St. Clair River near Detroit. Much of the blame for high Lake Michigan water levels, however, is aimed at artificial regulation of the waters flowing in and out of Lake Superior.
Much of it is under the jurisdiction of the International Joint Commission, which is set up by a treaty with Canada. And so that is in the domain of international affairs. There's no law that Congress can pass.
The Boundary Waters Treaty, signed by the United States and Canada in 1909, regulates and resolves disputes regarding the two nations' shared use of water. Specifically, it states, diversions which affect the natural level or flow of the Great Lakes shall not be made except by the authority of the United States or the Dominion of Canada and with the approval of the International Joint Commission. Only two of the Great Lakes are regulated by the IJC, Lake Superior and Ontario. Lake Ontario lies below Niagara Falls and has no effect on the upper lakes, so the controversy focuses on Superior. Much of it surrounds the diversion of water from the Albany River Basin into the Great Lakes watershed. In 1939 and 1943, Canada built two diversion dams with consent from the Roosevelt administration, suggesting that more hydroelectric power might be needed to defeat Hitler's Germany. Two rivers, the Ogoki and the Kenogami, were diverted into Lake Nipigon and Long Loch. Power plants were then built on the north shores of Lake Superior, whereas they might not be justifiable in the remote areas along the Albany River. The added water raises Lake Superior by 2.5 inches, Lakes Michigan and Huron by 4.5. The rest of the debate zeroes in on the IJC's regulation of Lake Superior's outflow. Since 1916, the Commission has modified the rules several times to obtain improved conditions on the lakes. Currently, Plan 1977, which was generated in large part to high levels in the 70s, is used to determine the outflow from Lake Superior. Its objective is to balance the levels between Superior and Lakes Michigan and Huron, so that maximum benefits are provided to all interests with a minimum of adverse effects to any. This means the level of Lake Superior cannot exceed 602 feet, slightly below its record high level. If it were allowed to exceed 602, extensive damage would occur along the Lake Superior shoreline.
However, just because Lake Superior cannot exceed this level should not mean that all the excess be dumped into Lakes Michigan and Huron. That is not a balancing policy. Maybe we should all share in the damage to our shorelines.
But something is being done. Last January, the Great Lakes Governor's Task Force called for changes in the structure of the IJC. It seeks a larger and more meaningful role of the states and provinces in discussions between the two federal governments involving the IJC. More immediate action this spring helps stave off even higher levels. In April, Governor Blanchard petitioned Secretary of State George Shultz to seek a halt to the Ogoki diversion. 2 months later, the Canadians agreed. In addition, the IJC reduced the outflow through the St. Mary's River by 1/3. The effect of these two actions dropped the levels of Lakes Michigan and Huron by nearly 3 inches at the end of September. But in late October, Canada indicated it wanted to resume the Ogoki diversion, which prompted Governor Blanchard to reissue his request for a halt.
What it boils down to is this: the regulation of Lake Superior will not eliminate the problem of high lake levels. That leaves us with one alternative: increased diversion out of the Great Lakes Basin. But that too is frustrated with problems. We'll cover the dilemma of diversion in our next report. I'm George Lessens, TV 13 Eyewitness News.
The natural outlet for all the upper Great Lakes is through the Niagara River over Niagara Falls. The other outlets are man-made diversions. The Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal and the Calumet-Sag Channel direct water from Lake Michigan into the Illinois Waterway and eventually into the Mississippi. The Welland Canal, which is part of the St. Lawrence Seaway system, diverts water around Niagara Falls into Lake Ontario. Much of the debate focuses on increasing the flow of water through these waterways. Some have even suggested building pipelines or canals and shipping the water out west. These are all valid ideas, but ones which may set dangerous precedents.
That once they're done, someday might backfire on us in terms of we lose our legal precedents to prevent the wholesale exportation of our water.
We don't want to get stuck in a situation where suddenly we have other parts of the country bleeding away the water of the Great Lakes in a fashion then that we would not be able to stop.
Water flowing out of Lake Erie is controlled by the narrow stretch of the upper Niagara River near Buffalo. 200,000 cubic feet of water flows through this natural bottleneck every second, but only so much water can go through this stretch of the river. The rest backs up into the upper lakes. Some have suggested deepening this 5-mile section to increase its capacity, but a study conducted by the International Joint Commission concluded that increasing the flow without the ability to restrict that outflow when needed in times of low water levels would cause immeasurable harm to navigation on the lakes. Nevertheless, on November 12th, Michigan's 18 congressmen petitioned Secretary of State George Shultz, asking that he enlist Canadian support for a new study of how Lake Erie's levels could be regulated, perhaps by even building an additional diversion canal around Niagara Falls. But that would take years. Some minor regulation of the Welland Canal is possible, but the flow cannot change much from the 9,400 cubic feet per second without a major impact on navigation. However, the canal does lower Lakes Michigan and Huron by over 2 inches a year, offsetting part of the 4.5-inch rise contributed by the 2 Canadian diversions. The only other existing alternative is increased diversion through Chicago.
That authority is in, of all places, the United States Supreme Court, and they are the functionary that decides how much they're going to let out.
In 1967, after 3 previous attempts had failed, the U.S. Supreme Court ordered the flow out of Lake Michigan reduced from 10,000 cubic feet per second to no more than 3,200. It was in the early 1960s when the state of Michigan asked the court for a ruling to help keep lake levels from dropping too much at a time when those levels were abnormally low. The court decree did not go into effect until March 1970, but by then the water levels had climbed to normal and have been consistently high ever since. At its present rate, the Chicago diversion lowers Lakes Michigan and Huron by 2.5 inches a year. Added to the Welland Canal outflow, this completely balances the inflow from the Canadian diversions. But why not get the court to rescind its decision?
Michigan, as a state, having been the original party to the lawsuit that settled in the Supreme Court how much water could go out, had to be the petitioning party to the Supreme Court if there were going to be any changes.
But so far, state officials have been unwilling to do this. They are getting pressure from Governor Thompson of Illinois, who will fight any increased diversion which might cause flooding in downstate Illinois. That leaves lakeshore residents with very few alternatives, none of which are easy. In our next report, we'll look at the untold damage being caused by these high lake levels and who might be responsible. I'm George Lessens, TV 13 Eyewitness News.
Material is constantly being transported along our shorelines. As waves break, run up the shore, and return, they carry that material onshore and offshore. This is called littoral drift. Waves arrive at an angle to the shoreline and set up a longshore current, moving that littoral material parallel to the shore. Any type of structure which interrupts the flow can have undesirable effects. It is these structures that have lakeshore residents pointing the fingers of blame, mostly at the Army Corps of Engineers and their navigation jetties.
In this area, we got the Corps of Engineers to blame because they shut the pier off and they stopped the lateral flow of sand along here.
High water would mean nothing to us if our material that made up our shorelines were there in its place, where its natural state should be.
Prior to 1930, these structures were porous. They allowed the littoral material to flow through them, unimpeded along the shoreline. But in the 1930s, these jetties were hardened with boulders, so this material wouldn't have to be dredged out of the channels as often. This impedes the longshore current and diverts the material lakeward, where it is difficult to get back into the shore zone. The ability of water to move this material also depends on its speed. High-energy waves or fast-moving currents can carry larger and heavier littoral drift, which keeps the material suspended in the water rather than depositing it along the lakeshore. Hardened structures such as seawalls and jetties intensify a wave's energy, making it a destructive rather than a constructive force. Holmberg has been a frequent critic of the Corps for its failure to recognize this fact.
By not recognizing how influential and that these structures are and how much damage they've caused, is that it's going to be a hard one to handle.
But the Corps readily admits that 80% of their structures in the Great Lakes have had an impact on shoreline erosion.
All these structures, to some extent, have been identified as having impacted detrimentally, accelerating the erosion process within a certain distance of the structures.
For example, the Army Corps estimates that the federal navigation structure in South Haven causes 81% of the loss of the littoral material every year. Congress ordered the Corps to offset or mitigate the effect of these structures. So in the case of South Haven, nearly 5,000 truckloads of material is brought in every year from upland sources and placed just south of the harbor entrance along a 3/4-mile stretch of beach. This action should allow more of the littoral material to get back into the shore zone, an action that will have to be continued for years.
Since the Army Corps is responsible only for public lands and not private property, that leaves lakeshore residents to fend for themselves. In our final report, we'll look at the options left to frustrated homeowners. I'm George Lessens, TV 13 Eyewitness News.
The beach in front of Dick Holmberg's Whitehall home is an example of erosion control success. 2 years ago, waves were crashing less than 20 feet from his door. Today, he has over 100 feet of reclaimed lakefront property. Holmberg is head of his own erosion control company and firmly believes the problem of controlling erosion stems from a lack of understanding.
I think we have to work towards educating people, and especially our leaders, that they have to recognize the importance of this issue.
Holmberg placed several concrete-filled bags made of a super-strong material just below the water line extending out into the lake. This low-profile groin-type system slows down the longshore current and dissipates the pounding waves, allowing a buildup of sand. But for all the success his method has brought others, an equal amount of failure. Take Donald Dempster of South Haven. Dempster has spent $10,000 to $15,000 over the past 15 years on wooden seawalls and more recently on Holmberg's method. Still, he has lost 80 feet of bluff.
But when you've got an investment like a home, you spend what you have to.
Dempster and his neighbor Leo Mascarello are now only 40 feet from disaster. Over the Labor Day weekend, they filled 55-gallon drums with cement and barricaded their shorelines. If these fail, Mascarello says, the prospect of saving their homes is dim.
You're looking at $50,000 to move a house back. I don't know, probably walk away from it. For $50,000, I can erect a house in front of this one.
This story is repeated many times up and down the lakeshore. Some haven't been as fortunate. 2 weeks ago, several homes in the Stickney Ridge area of Grand Haven fell victim to the latest storm. This Army Corps publication outlines several plans of action to combat erosion, but according to Holmberg, most are neither low in cost nor protect the shoreline. Some are even potential pollution hazards or even dangerous. Seawalls and bulkheads are usually installed as a last resort. These hardened structures intensify waves, speed up the longshore current, and carry away the building material. They often fail when water levels rise or are undermined by the waves. Riprap and broken up concrete, sometimes with protruding iron bars, are often used in revetments. A revetment breaks up a wave's action, but does little to slow down the longshore current. Even tires and 55-gallon drums from origins unknown are allowed by the Army Corps and the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. Holmberg says this should raise a yellow caution flag because nearly 50 communities get their drinking water from Lake Michigan. But there's little that homeowners cannot place in the water as long as a permit is granted.
As long as the applicant, the individual applying for the permit, is using a construction technique that is valid and meaningful, that history has demonstrated it does the job, we really have to permit those types of structures.
Residents who recently purchased federal flood insurance may be left high and dry in one sense. A spokesman for the Federal Insurance Administration says claims for homes damaged or destroyed by erosion will probably be denied. because erosion by normal wave action or heightened by a storm is an ongoing process and not a flooding of normally dry areas. But 4th District Congressman Mark Siljander is seeking to clarify the wording of the National Flood Insurance Program. Plus, he is pursuing tax credits for installation of erosion control devices and low-interest loans to those who wish to install them. One last resort is a program administered by the state of Michigan. The Emergency Home Moving Loan Program provides a 3% interest rate subsidy to eligible homeowners. Many residents see this as retreating in defeat from a problem they didn't create.
The controversy surrounding high lake water levels is far from over. Debate over what should and should not be done will rage on. But one thing is clear. Any decision will have far-reaching and long-term consequences. For that reason, we must move slowly and carefully. But unlike these waters, time is running out. I'm George Lessens, TV 13 Eyewitness News.